A grieving billionaire, a rain-soaked young mother, and one quiet request for leftovers changed everything. What began as a single act of kindness turned into a journey of healing, trust, and unexpected love. This story will break your heart and then gently put it back together. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story that might just change your life. I never intended to share this table with anyone again. Not since the crash. Not since the world shrank down to the space between my fingertips and the edge of a linen napkin at Marlowe's, table 14. Every October 17th, at precisely 7 p.m., I come here. Same steak, same wine, same silence. The waitstaff know not to ask questions anymore. They just nod, place the filet and the garlic potatoes in front of me, and retreat. The chair across from mine always stays empty. They used to ask if someone would be joining me. I used to explain. Now, I guess the hollow weight of absence explains it itself. I don't come to eat. I come to remember. My wife, Lila, used to laugh when I'd insist on steak medium rare every anniversary, like it was a sacred rite. Our son, Aiden, would order chicken tenders and dunk them in wine sauce just to mock me. They both died 6 years ago on Lakeside Drive. The road was wet, and I was supposed to be the one driving, but I got caught up on a late call. They went ahead. That was the last time I heard either of their voices. The food arrives perfectly plated, untouched. I never touch it. It's not for nourishment, it's for grief. Until tonight. It started with a whisper. A voice so careful, so soft, I almost thought I imagined it. "Please, could I have your food?" I blinked, my knife hovering mid-air over the tender cut of meat I had no intention of cutting. The blade caught the candlelight, flickering like a question I didn't know how to answer. Slowly, I looked up. She stood just beside the table, soaked from the light drizzle still falling outside. Her hair was pulled back into a weary bun, strands clinging to her cheeks. She couldn't have been older than 20, maybe even younger. Her coat was too thin for October, sleeves damp, fabric clinging to her arms. In her grasp, held close against her chest, was a baby bundled in a flannel blanket, fast asleep, or maybe just too tired to cry. She didn't look at me, she looked at the plate, but not with hunger, not with desperation, just tiredness, deep bone-set tiredness that no sleep could fix. A waiter spotted her, already moving in, brows knitted into the kind of concern that leads to security. But I lifted one hand just slightly, a signal, not yet. Let her speak. "No dramatics," she said, glancing at the child in her arms. "Just for him." My chest tightened. It felt like something behind my ribs cracked and let air in where it hadn't in years. I didn't speak. I didn't ask questions. I just slid the plate across the white tablecloth until it reached the edge closest to her. She didn't reach for it. Not immediately. First she looked at me, really looked, like she was searching my face for fine print, for strings, for some hidden motive. There weren't any. Not tonight. The baby stirred. She shifted, adjusting him gently without waking him. His cheeks were pink, full, soft, the way babies' cheeks are before the world hardens them. She kneeled down next to the table, tore off a small piece of steak, blew on it, tested it against her wrist, and placed it against the baby's lips. His mouth opened instinctively. He chewed without complaint. For a long time, I just watched. The way her hands moved. The way she crouched beside the table, one knee on the marble floor like it was a throne. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask to sit. She didn't even ask for help. She asked for food for her child. And she fed him first. I don't know what came over me then, but I stood. Reached into my coat, took a folded $100 bill from my wallet, and tucked it beneath the bread plate. She noticed, but said nothing. I adjusted my sleeves, nodded once, and walked toward the door. I didn't speak to her. I didn't even know her name. But as I passed the tall mirror near the exit, something made me turn. Just a glance. She had taken the seat across from mine. Lila's seat. She wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling either. She tore another small piece of potato and fed the baby again. He cooed, then laughed, giggled like someone had just told him the best joke in the world. That sound reached somewhere deep inside me, somewhere I thought had gone numb. I walked out into the mist, the valet holding the door open without a word. As I slid into the back seat of the black sedan, Marcus, my driver of nearly 5 years, looked at me through the rear view. "Home, sir?" I nodded. But I turned to look back. Through the fogged window I could still see her. Just a faint shape in the candlelight behind the glass. Her son, Noah, I'd learn later, was giggling, waving a piece of asparagus like it was a magic wand. She had taken nothing from me. Not really. She hadn't asked for a job or a place to stay, not even for my name. She'd reminded me, without intending to, that there was still a reason to slide the plate across, that the gesture itself meant something. That maybe, just maybe, I wasn't done offering. 6 years of silence, broken by a single request, and somehow, that one moment, it felt like the beginning of something I wasn't ready to lose. Not again. The car hummed beneath me, a soft vibration that filled the silence like a heartbeat I wasn't ready to admit was mine. I sat still in the back seat, my fingers tapping once, just once, against my thigh. A nervous rhythm. The rain had quieted to a mist, clinging to the windshield like breath. Outside, streetlights blurred into amber streaks, and for a while I let them blur everything. But my mind, it was still sitting at table 14. I saw her there, even now. That girl, Sophie, with her baby nestled against her chest like a secret she had to protect from the world. She hadn't looked at me with pleading or manipulation. Just need. Simple and unadorned. And she hadn't taken anything but a plate I wasn't going to touch anyway. Marcus glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his voice respectful, as always. "You all right, sir?" I didn't answer right away. I leaned forward slightly, not to meet his eyes, but to look behind us. Out the rear window, Langford's shrank into the distance, its tall brass-edged windows still glowing warmly through the fog. And in the corner, just barely, just a flicker, I caught a glimpse of her again. She hadn't left. She was still sitting at the table, still feeding her son. Still in the chair that hadn't held anyone but ghosts since Lila died. I couldn't tear my eyes away. She was breaking the steak into soft bits, testing each one carefully before placing it on the baby's tongue. Noah, I guessed, though I didn't know his name yet. He gurgled again, laughing this time, full, free, completely unaware that he was rearranging the gravity inside my chest. And Sophie, she moved like someone used to making do. No complaints, no expectations, just deliberate tenderness. She hadn't eaten a bite herself. She was feeding him with both hands, and all her focus, like the world could burn down around her, and it wouldn't matter. So long as he ate. That was what undid me. "Drive around the block," I said suddenly, my voice low. Marcus didn't question me. He turned smoothly down a side street. I kept my gaze fixed on the mirror, on the place we were leaving behind, on the woman who had appeared like a crack in the polished surface of my grief. And I wasn't ready to let her disappear into it again. I didn't know her story. I didn't know her name. I didn't even know what she wanted beyond the plate she never asked for twice. But something in the way she stayed, quiet, solid, still, gripped me. It wasn't pity. I didn't feel sorry for her. I felt shaken. When we rounded the block and passed the front of Langford's again, the table was empty. Panic flickered in my chest. I scanned the sidewalk, the valet stand, the bus stop across the street. Nothing. No stroller, no flannel bundle, no Sophie. Then I saw her. Down the block, maybe 50 feet away, beneath the dark awning of a flower shop that had closed for the night. She was sitting on a wooden bench, the baby nestled back against her chest. A small cardboard container rested in her lap. Langford's must have boxed up what remained. She was half asleep, her eyes barely open. She looked like she'd fought through an entire winter just to make it to this dry patch of sidewalk. I got out of the car without a word, pulling my coat tighter against the wind. The air smelled like wet concrete and something floral left behind by the flower shop. I didn't know what I was going to say. I just knew I had to walk toward her. I stopped a few feet away, not wanting to startle her. Her eyes opened slowly. She didn't look surprised to see me, just tired, like she'd expected I might come but wasn't sure if that was good or bad. "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" I asked. She blinked at me, then glanced down at Noah, who stirred gently in the wrap but didn't cry. "Shelter on Franklin," she said after a moment. "They close intake at 10. Might still let me in." I looked at my watch, 9:53. "I can get you there in 5 minutes," I said. She studied me then. Not just with suspicion, but calculation. The kind people use when they've had promises broken too many times. Then she nodded once. We walked back to the car together. Marcus, God bless him, didn't say a word. He opened the door like Sophie belonged there all along. He only raised an eyebrow when she slid in beside me, baby and all. I gave a faint nod. That was enough. As we pulled away from the curb, Sophie murmured softly to the baby. I couldn't make out the words, but her hand moved gently across his back, slow and practiced. "What's his name?" I asked, almost afraid to speak. "Noah," she said. Her voice was hoarse, like it had been worn thin by more nights like this than I could imagine. "He's 7 months, like sweet potatoes, hates being cold." I smiled before I realized I was doing it. "And yours?" She looked over. "Sophie." "James," I replied. "James Whitaker." She tilted her head. "You don't look like a man who gives away dinner." "I'm not," I said. I looked out the window, my reflection barely visible in the glass. At least I didn't used to be. We reached the shelter just before 10. The light above the door was still on. It looked small, wedged between a laundromat and a pawn shop, like it barely belonged, but stood its ground anyway. Sophie turned to me before stepping out. "Thank you. For the food, for the ride." I wanted to say something to keep her from disappearing. Something meaningful. Something that would make her remember I wasn't just a man who gave a plate once a year. Instead, I reached into my wallet and pulled out a business card. No explanation, no pitch, just something real to offer. "If you ever need help," I said, "real help, call." She took it, but didn't promise anything. She tucked it into the same pocket where the baby's sock had come half loose. Then she was gone. I watched the door close behind her. Marcus glanced back at me. "Home, sir?" I didn't respond right away. I just stared at that door. Then I whispered, "We'll come back tomorrow, just in case." And for the first time in 6 years, the weight in my chest didn't feel so heavy, like someone had cleared space beside it. A new name, a baby's laugh. A girl who didn't ask for much, but reminded me, simply by staying still, that maybe I wasn't meant to eat alone forever. The next morning, the restaurant felt like a different place entirely. I'd never seen Marlowe's in daylight. Without the candlelight and hushed elegance of dinner service, it looked strangely plain. Less a monument to memory and more just wood and glass and silence. The linen cloths were stripped from the tables. The chandeliers, usually glowing like fireflies in a bottle, stood cold and still. I didn't know what I expected coming back, only that I'd woken with a restlessness that wouldn't let me stay home. I wasn't here for steak. I wasn't even sure I was here for her. The manager, a thin man with a silver tie pin and permanently raised eyebrows, met me at the door. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, his voice like a tight string, "we weren't expecting you this morning. We're closed to the public until 5. "I'm not the public," I said, and walked past him. He didn't stop me. Table 14 was bare, no folded napkin, no wine glass, no weight of ritual, just a scuffed wooden surface that seemed smaller in the sun. I stood there for a long moment, hands in my pockets, unsure what I was trying to find, until I noticed something wedged beneath the edge of the bread plate. A napkin. Folded once. Crisp, clean, and entirely out of place in a room being reset for another evening of curated grief. I picked it up. On it, penciled in clean, deliberate strokes, was a sketch. A rough layout of a lobby, reception desk, soft seating, angled light sources, a waiting area designed to invite, not contain. A hallway curved like a river, sightlines that made sense, even to my untrained eye. I turned it over. No name, just an arrow pointing toward a small corner with a single word scribbled beside it in tiny script, light. I stood there blinking at it like the world had tilted under my feet. She had drawn this. Sophie. Last night, in the middle of asking for food for her son, in the middle of having nowhere to go, she'd left behind a vision. She hadn't done it to impress anyone. She hadn't even handed it to me. She'd just made it. Like she couldn't help herself. And it was good. Not just passable. Not just clever. Good. Good in a way that made me see my office in River North differently. A space still under renovation, raw and half-formed, currently under the failing grip of a design firm that had given me 3 options that all looked like identical hotel lobbies. Cold, glassy, expensive, dead. But this sketch, this napkin, it breathed. I left Marlowe's without a word and drove to the Franklin shelter. The woman at the front desk wore a sweatshirt with a paint smear on the sleeve and reading glasses on a chain. She looked at me like she'd seen 100 men like me and didn't care for any of them. "I'm looking for someone," I said. Her eyebrows lifted. "This ain't a missing persons bureau." "She came in last night," I added. Young woman, baby boy, Sophie. I gave her a ride. The woman's expression shifted just slightly. You family? No, I said quietly. Then I added, but I might have a job offer. She gave me a longer look this time. She didn't smile, didn't soften, but she stood and disappeared through a door marked staff only. A few minutes passed. Then Sophie appeared. She wore the same coat, zipped halfway. Noah was curled against her chest, cheeks red from warmth and sleep. Her eyes were clear but heavy, like she hadn't had time to decide if she should be hopeful or suspicious. She didn't speak first. I wasn't sure if you'd come back, she said finally. I told Marcus we would, I replied. She adjusted the baby slightly. He liked the mashed potatoes. I saw, I said, and felt the edges of a smile tug at my mouth before I could stop it. People moved behind her, volunteers carrying laundry bags, a kid pulling a battered plastic truck across the floor, a mother herding 2 toddlers with practiced chaos. The world kept moving. Survival didn't wait. I meant what I said last night, I told her. About help. She sighed. Not a dramatic sigh, just a tired one. A sigh made of years, not hours. Look, she said, I'm not trying to be someone's project. I don't need to be rescued. I'm not offering salvation. I said, I'm offering opportunity. Her eyes narrowed. That usually comes with strings. I reached into my coat and pulled out a slim leather folio. Inside it was a manila envelope already filled. I run a tech firm, I said. We're rebranding, renovating our office in River North. We need a new layout, new vibe. My team can barely design a coffee mug. I paused. I saw what you left on that napkin. She blinked. You saw that? It was in proportion. It had movement, sight lines. You mapped a full lobby in under 3 minutes, with a pencil, on a napkin, in the dark. She looked away. Old habit. Well, I said, that habit is still useful. She didn't take the envelope, didn't run either. She just stared at it like maybe it was a trap or a test. I'm not looking for pity, she said again. You won't find any here, I said. Only deadlines. That made her laugh. It wasn't a performance laugh, it was real, dry, surprised, and it cracked the air between us in the best way. What would I be signing up for? She asked. 3-week freelance contract, paid up front. You don't have to come into the office. Email designs. If you need supplies, I'll have them delivered. No meetings, no games. She considered me for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached out and took the envelope. Noah let out a tiny sneeze and giggled. I looked at him. He seems on board. Sophie snorted. He thinks you're a food source. I've been called worse. She smiled again. Smaller this time. Realer. Then her voice dropped. Why me? I hesitated. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because it was the only honest one I had. Because you reminded me what it feels like to care again, I said. And because talent like yours doesn't belong under a wet awning outside a flower shop. Her lips parted slightly, caught off guard, but she didn't argue. Try one room, I said. One design. If it doesn't work, we both walk away. She looked at Noah, then back at me. I'll need a pencil set, she said, and tracing paper. Done. And real coffee. None of that freeze-dried garbage. I grinned. Now you're negotiating. We agreed to talk again in 3 days. She'd email the first drafts. If she needed to meet in person, we'd do it her way. No office, no pressure. And as I got back into the car, envelope still warm from her hands, I didn't feel like a man who'd just offered a lifeline. I felt like someone who'd just been given one. Later that night, at home, I lit a candle in my living room without realizing what I was doing. Lavender. Lila's favorite. I hadn't touched that drawer in 6 years. The scent curled into the corners of the room, unfamiliar and soft. And for the first time since the night they died, the house didn't feel like a mausoleum. It felt like a place something new might visit, even if just for a while. By the following week, Sophie had sent 3 sketches, all hand-drawn, all brilliant. She didn't use software, not yet. Just pencil on vellum and lines that breathed like living things. I opened the files on my tablet while sitting in the half-gutted atrium of Carter & Whitaker's new headquarters. The space was still raw, exposed beams, a concrete floor scattered with power tools, the smell of paint clinging to the air like static. But when I looked at her drawings, I didn't see what it was. I saw what it could be. She hadn't just designed rooms, she designed a mood. A story. A softened welcome. The reception desk curved inward like an open hand instead of a barrier. The skylights were angled to catch morning sun. There was even a tiny reading nook in the waiting area, bookshelves built low, as if children mattered here. As if families might walk through the doors and be reminded that work could also mean warmth. I was staring at one of the renderings when my phone buzzed. Dana, my assistant, sharp as a nail, clipped voice as always. "You're 3 hours early and already asking questions. Send them up," I said, without looking away from Sophie's sketch. A few minutes later, the sound of dress shoes on unfinished flooring echoed through the space. 3 board members entered the atrium like they owned it. Franklin, gray suit and grayer skepticism. Yolanda, whip-smart with eyes that missed nothing. And Nolan, young, loud, and always 3 questions behind the room. Franklin extended a hand. "Didn't expect to find you here this early in the build." "I like to keep my hands on the pulse," I replied, firm but calm. Yolanda nodded toward the table where Sophie's designs were spread out. "Is this the latest draft? The curves? The light angles? This isn't standard." "No," I said. "It's emotional." Nolan scoffed. "Since when do we brand with feelings?" "Since people stopped being robots," I said flatly. "This is the direction." Franklin tapped the table with 2 fingers. "Who's the designer?" I hesitated. Not long, just enough to register the weight of what I was about to say. "Freelance consultant, contract-based, Sophie Lane." There was a silence, a subtle shift of posture. Nolan's lips parted just a second before his brain caught up. "Wait, Lane? Is that the girl from the photo?" I stiffened. "What photo?" "The one circulating internally. A few folks saw you at Marlowe's a couple weeks ago, her with a baby, asking for scraps. Now she's designing our headquarters?" Yolanda didn't speak, but she studied me, hard. Nolan leaned in. "And we're trusting the rebranding of a $100 million space to a homeless 20-year-old with a sketch pad?" "She's not homeless anymore," I said, my voice sharp but level. "That's your answer?" "No," I replied. I turned the tablet toward them and tapped the screen. Sophie's rendering filled the digital display mounted on the temporary wall behind me. "This," I said, "is my answer." Yolanda stepped closer, narrowing her eyes at the image. "That's good." Franklin studied it, silent for a long moment. "Impressive," he admitted. "Her hand-drawn." "But still," Nolan pushed. "Who vetted her? What's her background? She's not on any registry, not in any design firm, not even a college graduate from what I can tell." "I vetted her," I said, "myself." "And we're supposed to believe this isn't personal?" "It is personal," I said, letting the words land, "because I believe in rebuilding things that others discard." Silence, not just awkward, tense, thick. Yolanda was the first to break it. "Let's see where the next revision goes. If she can deliver, I don't care if she drew it on the back of a receipt." Franklin gave a reluctant nod. Nolan said nothing. They walked off without further comment, leaving the air behind them colder than when they came in. A few minutes later, Dana approached, heels soft on unfinished tile. She handed me a memo, internal message, unsigned, but I didn't need a signature to know the intent. Subject: nepotism and reputation risk. Claim: CEO offering corporate opportunities to personal acquaintance without vetting. Risk of negative media attention. Strongly suggest review. I stared at the words like they were nails driven into the frame of something I was building with my bare hands. I deleted the message. Then I opened a new one. Addressed to Sophie. Subject: Phase 2, Conference Room C design message. You're not here to impress them. You're here to prove places and people can be more than what the world expects. Let's build something they can't ignore. I hit send, and for a moment as the message disappeared into the network, I realized something else. I wasn't trying to save her. I was trying not to lose what she made me remember. That even a man like me, surrounded by glass and deadlines and corporate theater, could still feel something warm when someone like her chose to sit across from me and simply stay. A day later, I got a call from her. No hello, no small talk. "Did they hate it?" she asked. "No," I said. "They're intrigued." "So they hated it," she said flatly. I chuckled. "They're rich, that's how they say good job." I heard her exhale, a quiet sigh of relief. I imagined her, one hand on Noah's back, a sketchbook on her lap, the future leaning toward her like a tree grown sideways toward light. "I need you to come in next week," I said. "There's a space, conference room. I want you to reimagine it." She didn't hesitate. "If I walk in with a baby on my hip, they'll think I'm the intern who lost her badge." "You're not an intern." "I know that," she said, "but people like them don't." I paused, then offered, "Let's meet off-site. Neutral ground, you pick. She thought for a second. There's a diner. West Kinsey. Corner booth. Thursday. 10 there. The line went dead, and I sat there, still staring at the warm light spilling through a skylight she hadn't even seen yet, knowing this. She wasn't just designing a space. She was redesigning something inside me. And I wasn't going to let them shut that down. She didn't show. I waited 30 minutes in the cold. The sculpture garden near the bridge was exactly where she said she'd be. It was the kind of place you came to when the city felt too close, too loud. A little stretch of quiet tucked into the skyline. Stone paths, iron benches, fountains that whispered instead of screamed. But Sophie wasn't there. I called. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. I texted. Nothing. No on my way, no something came up, just silence. I waited longer than I should have, staring out over the water as the clouds bunched low over the skyline. When I finally walked back to the car, Marcus didn't say a word. He just opened the door with the same unreadable calm he always wore. But I could feel his glance in the mirror the entire drive back. That night, I tried again. Her phone number was disconnected. No forwarding number, no email reply, no trace. Gone. At the office, the world moved on like nothing had changed. Contractors framed walls according to her last submitted blueprints, humming as they hammered. Dana asked about investor meetings. The board sent another memo about timelines and budget revisions. The usual chaos, dressed in tailored suits. But I felt it. The absence, worse than grief. I told Dana to call the Franklin shelter. They hadn't seen her since checkout 2 nights ago. I told Marcus to swing by the public library she mentioned, empty. Even stopped by the diner on Kinsey. The waitress remembered her. Said she had a cup of coffee, didn't finish it. Left a tip in quarters, that was 2 days ago. She had vanished. The only thing Sophie left behind was a design folder on my desk, hand-delivered by courier in a plain brown envelope with no return address. Inside, the completed plans for the 3rd floor. Detailed, measured, labeled, a flawless blend of functionality and warmth. She had included material samples, lighting notes, even acoustic considerations for foot traffic and conversation flow. Taped to the back was a yellow sticky note. This was never about building something for you. It was about proving I could still build. Thank you for the table. SL. I sat in my office staring at the note for longer than I'd care to admit. Everyone assumed Sophie needed me. But the truth? I needed her more. She reminded me I still had a pulse, and now she was gone. That night, I walked through my penthouse apartment as if I didn't belong to it anymore. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a pristine view of the city, but I didn't bother looking out. The skyline felt empty, just steel and distance. I passed the fireplace. Lila's photo still sat on the mantel beside our son Aiden's, a still moment, frozen in perfect smiles. I didn't stop to look. I couldn't. In the kitchen, I opened the fridge and stared at its contents like I'd just discovered refrigeration. Everything inside was neat, prepped, soulless. Bottled water, cubed cheese, vacuum-packed meals I didn't even remember ordering. I closed the door and walked down the hallway. Stopped in front of the one room I hadn't entered in over a year. Aiden's room. I opened the door slowly. The air was stale with dust and memory. His toy cars were still lined up on the shelf by size. The lamp, shaped like a rocket ship, still sat on the nightstand, unplugged. The bed was made, blanket tucked just the way I used to do it after story time. I sat down on the edge of the bed and gripped the bedpost, knuckles white. 6 years of grief had turned routine, a script I didn't know how to stop reading. And now, Sophie, this girl I barely knew, had slipped through my fingers before I had the courage to ask her to stay. And the worst part wasn't that she left. It was that I hadn't done enough to make her want to stay. She told me once, maybe you're risking too much. But now I knew the truth. I hadn't risked nearly enough. I stood suddenly, yanked on my coat, and was back in the car with Marcus behind the wheel before I could second-guess myself. We drove to Franklin Avenue, where it all began. The shelter manager recognized me. "She's not here," the woman said gently. "Checked out 2 nights ago. Didn't leave a forwarding address." I was about to thank her and leave when she hesitated. "She did leave this," the woman added. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Said I should give it to you if you ever came back. I took it slowly. The handwriting was unmistakable. "James, I needed to disappear before I started believing I could stay. You gave me more than a plate. You gave me space to remember who I was before I had to be everything for someone else. Don't look for me. I won't be where you expect. Sophie, that last line, I won't be where you expect, echoed in my mind all the way back to the apartment. I passed every bus stop, every closed flower shop, every corner that had once held a piece of her. But Sophie wasn't the type to fold herself into shadows. She walked into the light, even if it scorched her. I pulled up a dozen browser tabs. Community databases, free clinics, local art events, shelter registries, nothing. Then something caught my eye. A small flyer buried in a community center's event list. Mothers Reclaiming Space Volunteer Art Night. Location, Westside Resource Collective, no registration required, childcare provided. Her name wasn't on it, but the design in the background, the subtle curves, the sunlight filtering through hand-drawn windows, was hers. I knew it. I printed the flyer and set it on my desk like a treasure map. I didn't go that night, or the night after. I waited. 1 week later, I drove to the center and parked across the street. It was nearly 10 p.m. when the doors opened. Volunteers filtered out slowly, parents holding finger-painted drawings, kids clutching plastic cups of juice. Laughter drifted out into the night, and then, there she was, hair tied back, jacket too thin, Noah asleep in a carrier against her chest. She stepped onto the sidewalk, paused, and looked around, like she felt something. Her eyes found me across the street. We stared at each other. Neither of us moved. Then slowly, Sophie began to walk toward me. Every step careful, measured, like she wasn't sure the ground wouldn't vanish beneath her. You found me, she said, voice low, guarded. I was always going to, I replied. Why? I swallowed hard. Because this time, I'm not leaving first. She stared up at me, tired and unblinking. You can't fix me, she whispered. I don't want to, I said. I just want to build something. Her breath caught. She looked down at Noah, then back at me. And what if I vanish again? I'll wait, I said, even if it takes 6 more years. She didn't say anything, not right away, but she reached for my hand, and for the first time since Lila and Aiden left this world, I felt the warmth of something not gone, but just beginning. The diner hadn't changed in 30 years. The vinyl booth still squeaked when you shifted. The fans on the ceiling turned slow, like they were too tired to make a full revolution. The smell was a mix of burned coffee, old grease, and something oddly comforting, like time had forgotten this place, and in doing so, preserved it. I arrived 5 minutes early, wore a coat that didn't belong here, tailored navy wool, the kind that whispered legacy in boardrooms. I sat in the corner booth, the one Sophie had asked for, and ordered a coffee I didn't plan to drink. At exactly 10, she walked in. Jeans, a hoodie, clean but faded. Noah strapped to her chest in a fabric carrier, his head resting sideways, thumb tucked into his cheek. Her hair was pulled up tighter today, like she meant business. She didn't look around. She saw me instantly and came straight over. She slid into the booth across from me, adjusting Noah carefully between us. Then she spoke. Still think you're not trying to save me? I met her eyes. Still think you don't need anyone? Her lips twitched. No smile. Not yet. But the fire was there. She picked up the menu and studied it like it was a legal contract. I waited. Over the years, I'd learned some of the most important conversations don't start with words. They start in the quiet. Finally, she set the menu down. You didn't have to defend me in that meeting, she said. I didn't do it for you, I said. I did it for the design. Her eyebrows rose slightly. But I added, I'll admit, protecting both felt right. She stared at me. I don't want you putting your name on the line for someone like me, she said quietly. Not when you know exactly what people assume. And what kind of person is that exactly? She leaned back, crossing her arms. Someone who was sleeping in a shelter last week, who has to choose between formula and rent, who had a full scholarship to Parsons but dropped out in her 2nd year because life doesn't wait for your GPA to catch up. I didn't flinch. You think that disqualifies you? She shrugged. I think it makes me a gamble. And men like you don't bet on people like me, unless they're expecting something in return. There it was. Not bitterness. Not anger. Just the voice of someone who'd seen the world from the curb and knew better than to assume the helping hand wasn't going to close into a fist. I'm not asking for anything, I said. She looked at me for a long time. Then why keep showing up? I didn't answer right away. I looked at Noah instead, eyes wide and blinking, curious. Small fingers poking at the edge of the table like the surface might offer something back. "Because I saw my son in his face," I said, my voice low, and it scared the hell out of me. Sophie's expression changed, not softened, just shifted, more alert, more cautious. "You had a son?" she asked. "Aiden," I said. "He would have been 9 this year." Her voice dropped. "What happened?" I looked down at my hands. They were steady now, strange. "There was a crash. My wife and I were supposed to go to dinner together that night, but I got stuck on a call, so she took Aiden and drove herself. I was supposed to drive. I still replay that decision every night." "I'm sorry," she whispered. I nodded once. I stopped living that night too. It just took longer to bury the rest. She didn't speak, but something in the way she looked at me changed. It wasn't pity. I would have shut down if it was. No, it was something else, a recognition, a quiet acknowledgement from one survivor to another. "I wasn't looking for charity," she said. "I know," I replied. "I'm still not." "Good, because this isn't charity, it's investment." That made her chuckle. "You really know how to package your guilt in business terms." "Old habit," I said, smiling. The waitress came by and dropped off a plate of scrambled eggs for Noah, though I had ordered it under my name. Sophie blinked at it, then at me. "You really didn't come to play," she muttered. Noah squealed and reached for the food. Sophie helped him eat, fingers practiced and gentle, cutting the eggs into bits and sliding them his way. He babbled in between bites, grinning up at her like she was the whole sun. "I used to draw floor plans in the margins of my notebooks in high school," she said suddenly. "I'd redesign the cafeteria to make it quieter, or the library to have more corners." I smiled. "You were planning a better world." "Or maybe," she said, "I just wanted a space that didn't feel like it was squeezing the life out of me." "Well," I said, "you've done that for my company." "For me?" She looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Your next project," I said, "is the 3rd-floor community room and breakout space. We want it to feel less like a workplace and more like a place where things grow." She blinked. "You want me to design growth?" "I want you to imagine what it feels like to belong somewhere," I said, "and draw from that." She was quiet for a long time. Her fork paused halfway between plate and mouth. I let the silence hold. "Okay," she said softly, "but I want full creative draft freedom. No committee notes until 2nd round." I nodded. "You drive a hard bargain." "I have to," she said. "I've never had the luxury of failing." "You won't." We finished the meal slowly. Noah smeared egg on the table and Sophie's sleeve. She laughed, this time without restraint, and wiped his face with a napkin while he babbled away like he was telling us a secret. When we got up to leave, she turned to me at the door. "I'll send you the 1st round of designs next week," she said. "But don't expect miracles." I held the door open for her. "I don't need miracles," I said. "Just honesty." As she stepped out into the sunlight, the wind caught her hair and tossed it loose around her shoulders. Noah let out a squawk of delight and reached for the sky, like it belonged to him. I turned back to the booth, about to leave, when I noticed something on the seat. A napkin. Folded once, I picked it up, another sketch, this one, a spiral staircase lit from above by a round skylight. And beneath it, in her small, slanted handwriting, one line, "Sometimes the only way up is through." I folded it carefully and slipped it into my coat pocket. I didn't know what came next, but I knew this. I wasn't just rebuilding a space. I was rebuilding something I hadn't dared to name in years. Hope. 3 months later, the building opened under a silver morning sky. The new Carter and Whitaker headquarters in River North stood tall, its glass panels catching the soft winter light like sheets of frozen water. On the sidewalk, members of the press bundled in long coats and clutched coffee cups as they adjusted camera angles for the ribbon cutting. I should have been nervous. This was supposed to be a statement piece, a culmination of 2 years of construction, branding, and strategy. But standing in the atrium that morning, I felt nothing but stillness. Not the numb kind, the good kind. Like standing in the pause just before a piece of music begins. The space Sophie had designed was no longer a sketch or a hopeful rendering. It was real, and it was stunning. The atrium walls didn't tower over people, they welcomed them. Gentle curves where harsh corners used to be, skylights placed precisely where she'd drawn them, bathing the floor in a gentle golden hue. The reception desk had a subtle asymmetry, as if nudging visitors forward like a guide instead of a gatekeeper. To the side, the children's corner sat quietly tucked beneath a low arch. Books, soft cushions, a small rocking chair already smudged by little fingerprints from an early visitor. This wasn't just an office, it was a conversation. And Sophie had written it with her hands. I stood there alone for a moment longer, listening to the hum of anticipation build in the hallway behind me. A few staff filtered in, some whispering, others pointing at corners they hadn't expected to find, so warm. Then I heard them. Her footsteps. I turned. Sophie entered, holding Noah on one hip. He was bigger now, sturdier. His cheeks were rosier and his hair a little longer. He reached out for my jacket lapel like it was a toy he remembered. Sophie wore a navy blue dress, simple, clean, elegant. A silver bracelet at her wrist, her hair pulled back with just a few strands loose near her temples. She didn't look like a hired contractor. She looked like someone who belonged in the room she created. Not because of the design, but because of the soul she'd put into it. "He's going to fall asleep halfway through your speech," she said, brushing a hand over Noah's curls. "I'll take that as a vote of confidence," I said. We walked slowly together, just taking it all in. "It's almost exactly how I imagined," she said quietly. "Almost?" she smiled. "I didn't think it would feel this quiet, like it's waiting." "It was," I said. "It was waiting for you." She looked at me, and for a second I thought she might say something, but she didn't. Just nodded, eyes flicking back to the skylight. More people began to arrive. Executives, city officials, investors, familiar faces wearing expensive smiles and silk ties. They shook hands, complimented the space in generic phrases, asked about projected ROI as if warmth could be monetized. I barely heard them. I only watched Sophie. She took a seat near the back with Noah bouncing on her knee. I could see her eyes scanning the crowd, protective but calm. Dana handed me a microphone as I stepped up to the small platform. I didn't look at the crowd. Not yet. I looked at the room. At the way it held people gently. At the napkin sketch in my coat pocket that had become this. "I won't take much of your morning," I began. My voice didn't echo, it settled. "Most of you have read the press kits. You've seen the renderings. Some of you were part of the design process." I paused. "But what I want to talk about today isn't this building." The room quieted. "It's what we build when no one is looking." 6 years ago, I lost everything that mattered. My wife, my son, and in the years that followed, I became a man who measured success in square footage and quarterly reports. I built a routine, a ritual, but I stopped building anything real. Then one night, someone asked me for my food. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. In that moment, I didn't just give a plate. I was given something back. A chance to remember what it feels like to care, to trust, to start over. I scanned the room. She didn't ask for a handout. She asked for a seat. And in doing so, she reminded me that broken isn't the same as useless, that sometimes all we need is a light to step toward. I nodded toward the far wall, where a soft glow filtered in through one of the angled skylights Sophie had insisted on. "This space," I said, "was designed by someone who knows what it means to feel invisible and who refused to stay that way. Her name is Sophie Lane, and if you haven't heard of her yet, you will." At first the applause was hesitant, polite, then it grew. Warmer, fuller, real. I didn't look at Sophie right away. I was afraid if I did, I'd lose the composure I'd held together with every word. But when I did glance toward her, she wasn't clapping. She was just sitting still. Noah asleep against her chest. Her fingers curled lightly around the back of her chair. Her eyes were glassy, but she wasn't blinking them away. After the ceremony, the crowd mingled. People congratulated me on the build, the brand, the strategic empathy, as one marketing consultant called it. I walked away, found Sophie standing near the children's corner, tracing her finger across the top of a low shelf. "You should have been up there with me," I said. "I was," she replied. "I just didn't need the mic." We stood there in the middle of everything she'd imagined, not as CEO and freelancer, just two people who had tried very hard not to break. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small lunchbox. From it, she unwrapped a sandwich in parchment paper and handed it to me. "You didn't eat during your own ribbon cutting," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "Turkey and Swiss, little rosemary in the butter." I blinked. "You remembered?" "I always remember. she said. I took a bite. It was warm, familiar, human. I looked at her, really looked. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't the closing of a chapter. This was the beginning of the real story. Not about rescue, not about redemption, but about partnership, about the strength that lives in quiet places. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the folded napkin, the one with the spiral staircase and the line she once wrote, "Sometimes the only way up is through." She touched it like it was a relic from another life. "You kept it?" she asked softly. "It kept me," I said. Then she leaned in, resting her head lightly against my shoulder. Noah sighed in his sleep, and in a building born from grief but bathed in light, we stood still. Not in victory, not in triumph, but in peace. And that, after all this time, was enough. 3 months passed like a breath held too long and finally released. The new headquarters thrived. Clients raved about the space, its unexpected warmth, its invitation to linger. Interns curled up in the children's corner on lunch breaks. Executives took meetings beneath the skylights they once protested as a budget risk. Even Nolan, who once scoffed at the idea of emotional architecture, began quoting Sophie in strategy calls like he'd discovered her. But Sophie? She never leaned into the attention. She kept working, quietly, elegantly. Noah came with her sometimes, bundled against her chest or toddling along the hallways like he belonged there. And, in a way, he did. He giggled in staff meetings and scribbled on tracing paper. When he laughed, the room always shifted slightly, like the sound adjusted the air itself. One Thursday evening, I met Sophie at a small community kitchen in the basement of a church near Belmont. She hadn't invited me, she never did, but I'd started showing up anyway. She wore an apron over her jeans and moved like she had a second wind stored in her bones. Behind the counter, she ladled tomato soup into mismatched bowls while volunteers passed out bread. A teenager beside her struggled with a stubborn crock-pot lid. An older woman near the door hummed quietly as she arranged chipped ceramic mugs on a tray. Noah was asleep, cradled in a wrap across Sophie's chest, his breath slow and steady. She didn't look up when I walked in. She didn't have to. Something about her presence always shifted the room, and something about mine always found her. I waited at the end of the serving table, hands in my coat pockets, just watching. The line dwindled. The last few guests carried their trays to folding tables, heads bent low over the steam. Sophie finally turned. "I thought I told you not to find me here," she said, half smiling. "I ignored you," I replied, stepping forward. "Just like you ignored me when you vanished that night." She handed the ladle to a new volunteer and wiped her hands on a towel. Her shoulders were looser than I remembered. Not unburdened, just less tense, like she'd learned to carry the weight differently. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Because you are." That's not an answer. I took a slow breath. Then I gave her the truth. "I haven't stopped thinking about you. Not since Marlowe's. Not since you asked me for my food and then handed me back something I didn't know I'd lost." She crossed her arms. "You sound like one of those nonprofit brochures." I laughed. "Give me credit. I've learned from the best." "You're not here to hire me again," she said. "No," I said. "This isn't about a contract. It's not about work." She paused. "Then what?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "I want to make a different kind of offer. Not a project. A life. With you. If you want it." She looked away quickly, then back at me, then down at Noah. Her face was composed, but I could see it. Panic rippling beneath the surface. For someone who had faced nights without shelter, conversations with CPS, eviction notices on her windshield, this, somehow, was more terrifying. "I don't have a blueprint for that," she whispered. "Neither do I said, "but we can draw it as we go." The kitchen around us faded into hum. Voices, clatter, warmth, all still there, but muted by the moment between us. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they glistened, but she didn't blink it away. "You should know," she said, her voice catching. "I dumb with guarantees. I break down sometimes. I worry more than I should. I still flinch when someone raises their voice, and I don't always know how to ask for help." "Then let me learn your language," I said. She stared at me. Really stared. And for the first time, I saw what she'd been guarding all this time. Not pride, not control, just the fragile hope that she might finally matter to someone who wouldn't vanish when it got messy. I reached into my coat and pulled out a folded napkin. The corners were worn now, The pencil sketch faded slightly from being opened too many times. The spiral staircase, the skylight, her handwriting. She took it gently, like it might tear in her hands. "You kept it?" "It kept me," I said. There was silence. Then a breath. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." A half laugh, a half sob. "Okay to the life, to the rebuild, to the unknown." Noah stirred in her wrap, letting out a soft whimper. She swayed instinctively, brushing her fingers across his cheek. "He still thinks I'm a food source," I said softly. "You are," she said, a grin tugging at her lips. "Just in a different way." We stood in that warmth another beat. Then the old church bell upstairs rang twice. Time for cleanup. "Come back next week," she said, turning toward the sink. "I plan to," I replied. "Same time, every time." She didn't look back. She didn't need to. I grabbed a towel and joined her at the sink, drying bowls beside her like I'd done it 100 times. There was no kiss, no cinematic ending. Just two people side by side, choosing each other in the small, invisible ways that matter more than anything else. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't charity. It was a return. A home, not made of stone or glass, but of small daily choices. Kindness passed back and forth across a soup line. A hand on a sleeping child's back. A glance that said, "I see you, and I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in years, I didn't need to look ahead, because the life I wanted wasn't out there anymore. It was here, standing beside me, drying dishes, beginning again. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means something in this journey. James's grief, Sophie's strength, or maybe the quiet resilience of a little boy named Noah touched your heart too. This isn't just a story about loss or love. It's about how healing doesn't always come in grand gestures, but in the small, quiet moments we choose to show up, for someone else and for ourselves. It reminds us that sometimes giving a plate of food means giving someone a reason to believe again. So let me ask you, where are you watching from? What part of the world are you in right now? I'd love to know. Your stories matter too. If this moved you, inspired you, or made you feel a little less alone, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We have many more stories coming. Stories about rebuilding, reconnecting, and remembering what it means to be human. Until next time, stay kind, stay open, and never underestimate what a single act of grace can set in motion.